When I was 12 years old, I went to a week-long scout camp with my troop. Our campsite was notably isolated from the majority of other sites, so even though there were hundreds of kids at the camp overall, there were probably 5 of us kids and 2 or 3 leaders in our site. I shared a tent with 2 other kids. Being the anti-scout that I was, I brought a full-size cot to sleep on, while the other kids slept on the ground. I'm a horrible sleeper in any conditions other than my own bed, so I've always taken sleeping pills when I go camping. I sometimes have strange reactions to them, where I don't sleep well and I get dreams confused with reality. On our final night at camp, it was storming with lightning everywhere. We were in a creeped out mood, telling scary stories before trying to go to sleep. I couldn't wait to go home the next morning. I took my pills and I somehow managed to fall asleep. I woke up a few hours into the night. I opened my eyes and in the darkness I could barely make out the figure of a crouched over man. I'd woken up because he gently grabbed my leg and he didn't look like any of the leaders from what I could tell. Confused, groggy, and horrified, I said, "What?" The figure remained silent. After a week on these sleeping pills, I knew how they could make me confused. I closed my eyes, hoping that it was just the pills combining with the night of scary stories. I felt the gentle grip on my leg again, and the figure was still standing there. "What?" I said again, this time a little more panicked. Suddenly, still without a word, the man leaned down onto the ground next to me, where I couldn't see him because I was elevated. I couldn't hear anything strange happening, but I was filled with so much horror that I couldn't even bring myself to peek over the edge of my cot. I was still unbelievably tired and confused, and in my frightened stupor, I convinced myself that the sleeping pills were causing me to blend my nightmares with reality. I drifted in and out of a horrified semi-sleep for the rest of the night, wondering what had happened. I never recalled hearing anything notable or seeing the man leave the tent, so once the sun began to dimly light the tent, I mustered up the courage to look over the edge of the cot. The kid next to me was fast asleep and he appeared to be unharmed. If this was all there was to this story, I would dismiss it as a weird reaction to my sleeping pills. But then, the next morning over breakfast, the kid who had been next to me asked me and our tent mate if somebody had come into our tent overnight. The other tent mate said he assumed that one of us was just getting up to pee and then had gone back to sleep after. When we all confirmed that none of us had gotten up in the night, we started freaking out, begging our leaders and the other scouts to admit that one of them had played a joke on us, or that they had a history of sleepwalking. Nobody ever had any idea what we were talking about. I don't know what someone's motives would have been just to come into our tent to gently touch my leg and be silent. Unless I have some serious mental blocks, there was no kind of violation that I can recall. Just a very strange, quiet intruder. I was in the mountains of North Carolina for several days. It was a beautiful and peaceful camping trip with my brother, sister, and their friend Caleb. Until one early morning around 3 a.m. when it seemed like every creature in a 10-mile radius was going nuts. Being from the Midwest and having survived 2 tornadoes, I thought the worst weather event of my life was about to occur, and I was sleeping in a hammock. For those who don't know, just before a tornado is formed above your head, every animal in sight will be freaking out. They know, they can feel it, and you can feel it too. You just don't know what that new feeling is when 60-year-old trees beside you are ripped from the ground. Being in the eye of a tornado is even more strange, as all those same animals in sight are just frozen. I mean, sure, they still exist, but their little soul is on hold and they don't do much more than just look around quietly. It's honestly very creepy. Anyway, this was not a tornado. 3 a.m. The fire we made was just embers and the roaring thunder of animals freaking out. I peeked my head out of my hammock. There was no bad weather. There was no storm or looming catastrophe. It was a beautiful night, aside from the roaring animal kingdom. My brother peeked his head out of the hammock above me and looked down to see if I was awake. When he saw my eyes as wide as saucers, he whispered, "What is happening?" The terrifying noise continued for about 30 seconds, and then it just suddenly stopped. It seemed to be a sweeping effect where the outside of the radius stopped first and the creatures closer to us stopped last. But it was only a single second or two difference. It was pretty synchronized. My brother and I were pretty freaked out at this point. After 5 minutes of silence, we got out of the hammocks and started the fire up again. This time we made sure it was big enough to light up 100 feet out. The last thing we need is a Bigfoot or some weird stuff going down. My brother went up to the ridge to check on my sister and Caleb, about 60 feet uphill from our hammocks. Caleb always wanted to be in the highest possible, safe spot so he could watch the sunrise from his hammock. As soon as my brother got to their hammocks, he yelled a shrieking kind of yell to me, the kind I've only heard from him twice before. When his friend got his bike handlebar lodged in his stomach about an inch deep as a kid, and when he split his own head open. I ran up to the ridge with an axe in my right hand, the first aid bag in my left hand, and a flashlight in my teeth, expecting the worst. When I arrived to Caleb's bottom bunk, he was in a state of shock. His eyes were wide open, and he was shivering and shaking, and he was staring down at the valley. Wouldn't you know, my sister didn't even wake up. Figures. She had her headphones in all night, listening to her music. Apparently she hates the sound of animals and prefers to be in a controlled mental state where nothing can make her paranoid. We woke her up and she had no idea what was going on. She just stayed in her hammock like, "What do you want me to do?" We eventually got Caleb down to the fire and wrapped him in some blankets. I gave him a shot of whiskey to sip on, but he mostly just held it and stared into the fire. The whole night was just too weird to sleep. But Caleb finally laid down next to the fire and fell asleep around 5 a.m. The sun came up and my siblings and I decided to leave the fire to go see the sunrise from the ridge. We all sat in Caleb's hammock, still bewildered. The sun was perfect and Caleb picked out the best spot you could imagine, as usual. But then my brother spotted something strange. "What's that?" he said, pointing down to the valley. "Right there, on the bank of the river." My sister and I struggled to get his perspective, but then finally noticed a clearing. We decided to go check it out, but one of us had to stay with Caleb. My sister volunteered, as she hates creepy things. She didn't want us to go down, but we insisted. I left her my axe and emergency GPS signal thing. I told her just to scream if she needed us and not to hesitate to use the pepper spray. She just said, "Stop freaking me out and just go. I'll be here when you get back." So my brother and I hiked down to the river. It took around 20 minutes, but when we arrived, we felt very uncomfortable. There are no animals around whatsoever. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. The clearing on the riverbank was about 100 yards upstream, and we took to the higher side of the bank to keep our distance. I don't think either of us actually expected anything to go down, but we wanted to remain cautious. When we were about 50 yards away, at a slight elevation of the clearing, we pulled out our phones to take pictures, but our phones were dead. Mine is known to die, but I have an external battery pack that attaches to my OtterBox, and I know that was fully charged. My brother's phone is always reliable and usually attached to his portable solar panel charger that he keeps on the outside of his pack. But his phone was dead too. Both of us tried to hold our power buttons, not believing they were actually dead. But when we realized they were definitely not going to turn on, we both got a paranoid look on our face. We decided to leave, but not before carefully studying the clearing for a few seconds. It was about 100 feet across and the shape of a triangle. All the bushes and plants that typically grow along the riverside were all flattened down. Even some mature azalea bushes that typically stand 6 to 8 feet tall were eerily laying flat. It's as if everything in that triangle shape had bent down as close to the ground as it could get. Nothing appeared broken, but rather if it had grown along the earth instead of growing up towards the sun. It was really weird, and it was only in that triangle area. When we got back to our camp, Caleb was awake. My sister had a weird look on her face, and Caleb was totally normal. "Hey bro, you alright?" my brother asked. Caleb just casually answered, "Yeah man, doing well." Missed the sunrise, but I guess I needed to sleep. We just looked at him concerned, like, what the heck? He was eating breakfast and heating up coffee over the fire. We sat down across from him and asked, "So, do you remember what happened last night?" He looked at us puzzled. My brother added, "You know, like when all the animals were freaking out and we found you?" He just looked confused. My sister said, "Caleb, stop playing." And he asked, "What are you guys talking about?" My brother then said, "Bro, you were messed up last night." Caleb laughed and responded, "Yeah, I figured I had to be because I never sleep next to the fire all wrapped up in blankets. Not after getting that bug in my ear that one time." We continued to ask him questions, but he had no memory whatsoever. As far as he was concerned, he had a few too many drinks and slept next to the fire. We told him our story and each of us agreed, but he had no recollection. We told him about the spot next to the river and how our phones wouldn't turn on. We pulled out our phones to show him and they were already on, but my brother had 67% battery and mine was 41. And that gave us the creeps even more. We decided to pack up camp and get out of there and get away from that spot. But before we did a final sweep, Caleb asked, "Hey, have you guys seen my camera?" He had a very nice DSLR with nice lenses, and it was gone. The weirdest part is he slept with it in his hammock every single time he went camping, and we've never seen it not on his body. He even specifically remembered taking it to bed and tucking it in with him. It's like a ritual for him, and he takes super good care of his belongings. We searched around the ridge and all around the fire and in between the two spots, and it was nowhere to be found. Caleb even went down the ridge a bit, toward the river, in case it had fallen and rolled down the hill. But it was gone. We had to leave, and my siblings and I just agreed to pitch in to buy him a new one so we could get the heck out of there. About 3 miles and 1 hour later, my brothers turned to me on the trail and said, "Do you think he tried to take a picture of something he wasn't supposed to see?" The creepiest feeling swept over me, and I replied, "Bro, let's just forget about this and get the heck away from here." We both nodded in agreement. It's been about a year now, and they haven't seen or heard from Caleb in 8 months. No one has. So I'm a 26-year-old male, and I've been planning a camping trip with my wife and dad for a whole year. I wanted everything to be perfect, as we don't get away from town and dive deep into the woods as much as I'd like. This takes place in a very tree-dense Davy Crockett National Forest in East Texas. Earlier that day, my dad decided to go a little early and pick out a good spot for us to camp. To give a layout of where we camped, there were 2 dirt roads on either side of us and an overlook to the north of us. We camped in the middle, between the 2 dirt roads. My wife and I arrived and met our dad down there around 11 a.m. We set up camp and proceeded to enjoy the day until around dinner time, when we started to cook our meal for the evening. Right as we got done with dinner, we saw this truck circling around our campsite. He went around us several times and finally pulled right up into our camp and got out of his truck. He then proceeded to tell us that this was his family's campsite and how the firewood that was laying around us was his. Now in this particular forest, campsites are first come first serve, and my dad had been there since 9 a.m. He then asked if he could camp right next to us, and of course being friendly we said yes. We didn't know that when he said next to us, he meant directly on top of us. He backed his camper in so close to our tents and vehicles that he blocked my truck in. We weren't sure why he was doing this because there were so many other campsites available, but we just shrugged it off and tried to have a good time anyways. Not too long after that, we noticed a white Dodge dually circling around us. We had an off feeling about this truck because it went around several times, but we dismissed it because the area we were at was popular due to the overlook. After a long night of drinking and goofing off, we decided just to go to bed and call it a night. I was in a dead sleep when, out of the woods, I wake up to a blood-curdling scream. I jolt up and ask my wife, "What the heck was that?" About 30 seconds later, we hear another scream off in the distance. At this point, I grabbed my gun and unzipped the tent so we could go see. My dad had left a lantern burning so we could see a little ways into our campsite. At that moment, we see the white Dodge dually tearing down the road behind us. They continued down the road until they were out of sight. We heard them stop and get out of the truck, slamming the door and screaming. Then they proceeded to get back in the truck and drive very slowly down the other road that was in front of our campsite. At this point, we were terrified thinking they were coming to rob us, but they kept driving until they were out of sight. Then we heard them shooting. After the gunshots ended, they sped off again. At this point, we thought that maybe they were just drunk and acting stupid, so we didn't call the cops, and we didn't have signal anyways. We just tried to go back to sleep. The next day, we had to make a beer run for my dad, and when we made it out of our camping area and hit the main highway, there were police everywhere. They had stopped 2 young boys, and we assumed these were the ones who were being the troublemakers from the night before, and continued on into town. When we got back to our campsite, the cops were leaving after talking to my dad. They told my dad that the guys in the white dually truck had gone into the young guys' camp while they were out hunting and were robbing them. The boys walked up on their camp being robbed, and the dually guys pulled out guns on the young boys, proceeding to rob the boys at gunpoint. We think that if it hadn't been for the people that camped right on top of us, as strange as it was, they would have robbed us instead. They made our campsite look bigger than it actually was, and for once I'm thankful for those strange people. But the people in the white dually were never caught.